So now I'm very excited to bring the next speaker to the stage, Alicia Garza, a total powerhouse movement leader. In 2013, Alicia's love letter to Black people set in motion the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement. She is also the principal of Black Futures Lab, and in her new book, The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart, she reflects on her decades of organizing work and how we move from Black Lives Matter being not just a hashtag, but a long-term movement that can inspire and activate more people to fight for the world we deserve. Welcome, Alicia.
It's so good to be here with y'all. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Mercedes, I love you so much. I feel like I've known you for 100 years, and it's always good to see you. And thank you to the Greenlining community for having us today. We're about to get into an incredible conversation about movement building with some of the most innovative, creative, visionary strategists that you have ever seen. But first, before we get into that, I just want to say that we are in an incredible moment. And I was inspired by the previous conversation with my sister Ense and my brother Manuel. You know, it's a moment of opportunity that we have not seen in decades. And when you sit at the feet of OGs, right, they will tell you that what we are accomplishing right now is more than they could have ever dreamed of. And it reminds me, right, that even in the midst of chaos and transformation, in the midst of uncertainty, that there are always infinite possibilities for our freedom. So with that, we're going to get into an incredible conversation about movement building. And I want to just start off by saying that in this last year, we have seen historic and at times unlikely wins for racial equity and for racial justice. And the common thread here has been movement building and mass mobilization. This session that we're about to get into is going to explore effective strategies and lessons learned from a variety of movements that have galvanized change, from Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives to voter engagement tactics and beyond. Our speakers and this panel is going to explore what comes next to take movement building and civic engagement to the next level of real lasting change for communities of color. You know, folks, we are in a moment of reconstruction. And this morning, as I was preparing to help moderate this incredible discussion, I was reminded that over 150 years ago, this country was torn apart by the Civil War. Lots of us think that the Civil War was about slavery, but it wasn't actually about slavery. It was about a transition in our economic system and who could come along, who belonged, who benefits, and who would not. And in that period of Reconstruction, there were incredible gains that were won. Black men were enfranchised, given the right to vote. Chattel slavery was, formally abolished. There were freedmen's bureaus that were designed to redistribute land and redistribute assets so that everybody had a chance to succeed. It was also a period where in this country, we saw the rise of racial terrorism and racial violence. And in particular, it was right when the Civil War was ending that the Ku Klux Klan was founded. That was also when Abraham Lincoln, the president, was assassinated for his stance, right, on ending slavery. And I will say that, what I've learned about in this period of Reconstruction is that it was also the time that the Department of Justice was founded in this country, specifically for the purpose of fighting back against white nationalist terror and violence. It was a time when the Solicitor General position was created for the first time to literally go after racial terror groups and dismantle them. Well, as you know, that period didn't last for long. There was a window of maybe about 10 to 13 years, depending on which scholars you talk to. And then suddenly what was happening was that the same old rigged rules became re-entrenched. And it was then really that this movement that we see right now that is so powerful began in its roots, fueled by anger, fueled by a desire to keep us separate, fueled by a desire to maintain white power. This movement that we now call the right, the conservative right, was born. And that's when we started to see, Jim Crow laws and other kinds of black codes that were literally designed to keep us from advancing together. So that's why I'm so excited for this panel, because these leaders that I'm about to introduce are people who are on the front lines of reconstructing this society, not just for their particular communities, but bringing us together into a new fabric that will reestablish what it actually means, or what it could mean, to be America. So first, let me introduce my friend and powerhouse, Kat Brooks, who is the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. Kat has been engaged in the struggle against state violence for well over a decade. She's worked on the front lines of resisting state violence, including co-founding the Anti-Police Terror Project, which you probably just saw on United Shades of America, the new season on Sunday. And APTP's mission is to rapidly respond to and ultimately eradicate police violence from communities of color. Anti-Police Terror Project has trained thousands of people in their rapid response model, which is currently being implemented across the state of California and the country. Welcome, Kat.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi.
It's good to see you, Boo. Let me also bring up Dulce Garcia. Dulce is an immigration lawyer and the executive director of Border Angels, an immigrant rights nonprofit organization in San Diego. She brings her legal background and personal experience with the immigration system to her role and leadership to advocate for more humane immigration laws and policies. Welcome, Dulce.
Thank you for this space.
Thank you for being here. I also want to introduce my homie forever and ever, Mr. Alex Tom. Alex is the executive director of the Center for Empowered Politics, a new movement capacity building center, yes, that aims to train and develop leaders of color and grow movement infrastructure at the intersection of racial justice, organizing, and power building. With nearly 20 years of experience organizing for social and economic justice, Alex has organized in the working class Chinese immigrant community in solidarity with other communities of color and played key roles in forming multiracial alliances such as San Francisco Rising and Bay Rising. Welcome, Alex.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Boo. All right, y'all ready to get into it? We're about to go deep or something. Let me start off with you, Kat, because you've been on my mind. There are so many questions right now about what we do about policing. And frankly, you and I both know that police have been killing people in our communities really for generations, honey. But now that we have social media, everybody knows about it. And we keep kind of treating it like it's a new thing, but it's really a very old thing. Now, what's new, however, is that we are finally having a mainstream conversation about not just reforming policing, but getting rid of policing as we know it. And defund the police has been a conversation that is now really traveling the world, right? So I want to have a discussion with you, and I want to start off by asking you, because you're based here in Oakland, you've been doing this work with the Anti-Police Terror Project since well before the events of this last summer, but also well before people nationally, right, started having more of a mainstream conversation about policing. Let's root ourselves here in Oakland, but kind of zoom out too to talk about the trends nationally. What's happening here to address policing? And for folks in the audience who are inspired to take action, especially in other cities where this organizing might be new or less developed, what advice would you give around how to organize around this critical issue?
Okay, a lot to
sorry, it's a big one.
It is. And I'll say what I hope is happening in Oakland is that we are continuing to hold our position as the vanguard for how you respond to deal with state terror right? Specifically, what is happening here in Oakland that I think is different than some of the things that are happening in other parts of the country is we are in the process of extracting wins. And what I mean by that is we've moved from, to your point, Alicia, right, of telling the story over and over and over again about the Black genocide that is happening in this country to being able to extract wins from the consistent organizing that has been happening in Oakland, which really I attribute to starting in 2009, not starting, reigniting itself in 2009, beginning, of course, in 1966 with the formation of the party, specifically in response to police terror, right? So some things that are happening are the defund movement, right? We are in the middle of our budget cycle. Anti-Police Terror Project started the Defund OPD campaign almost 6 years ago. We did that in response to bloody 2015, where the Oakland Police Department murdered 11 Black men with no accountability and no acknowledgement. This was the same period of time where Libby Schaaf, our mayor, was touring the country. You probably remember this, Alicia, with former Chief Sean Wendt, and pointing to Oakland as a municipality that other cities could look like. That pissed us off. So we were in the streets pretty regularly. And then in 2016, you had the rape scandal of Celeste Guap, who was the age of 16 when the Oakland Police Department and 13 other law enforcement agencies began to traffic her. To where we finally were like, what are we paying them for? That's literally where it came from. We're like, what are we paying them for? And then we started to break down fiscally what being raped and terrorized and harassed and profiled and traumatized was costing Oaklanders, specifically Black Oaklanders. And what we uncovered was that it was costing us almost half of our general fund. Meanwhile, people don't have housing. Meanwhile, people don't have access to adequate food. Meanwhile, right, our mental health and trauma needs are going unmet, et cetera. And so we launched Defund OPD, and that's been 6 years of organizing. And it was a conversation that got us laughed at, or whispers behind our back, or those crazy radical people. And so flash forward to the uprisings of this summer, right, where Libby Schaaf tried again unsuccessfully to implement a curfew on our resistance efforts. We called a F Your Curfew March. The people responded that night with an overwhelming demand, right, to defund OPD. And so for us as organizers, what we saw was we had finally built the power, the base that we needed to leverage the power, and the city had to respond. So the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force was created, and their job was to identify places where we could defund OPD and invest in things that actually keep us safe. Investing in prevention rather than response, right? Investing in transformation rather than punitive rehabilitation. And that's happened. And so our budget has to be finalized by the end of June. And our city council on Monday passed a resolution that is asking for investments in things like mental health and trauma supports, housing, education, violence interrupters, as opposed to police who are violence responders. I really want people to understand that, particularly right now as we're seeing homicides spike all over the country because COVID has exacerbated the ills of poverty, right? Police don't solve that, right? The people do. Mental health does. Trauma supports do. Being in the above ground economy as opposed to being locked out of it and being forced to make a living in the underground economy. And so that's what our city just did. So that's happening really quickly, because I know I've gone on for a minute. We are developing alternative models. We've developed mental health first here in Oakland and in Sacramento, right? Up to 50% of all people that are murdered by law enforcement are in the middle of a mental health crisis. We asked the state, with our first demand of defund, was to invest in a model that didn't lead with law enforcement. And I said, fuck it, we're going to build our own. And we did. So those are the two primary things. We're extracting wins for the people here.
Let me ask you this, because, I'm not going to get into all the hand wringing that people do around this, right? I'm just not going to do it today. I'm sorry, y'all. I ain't got it in me. But what I do want to ask you is, how do you build the kind of coalition, the kinds of alliances that can help push this stuff forward, right? I mean, you and I are old enough to remember, right, when activism wasn't cool. People were like, oh, what is that thing y'all do? Right now, everybody's an activist. Okay, child, that's great. We need more people to participate. But as we're doing that, right, how are we building beyond the traditional activist community so that we are kind of changing these laws and changing these rules, changing these policies? Tell us a little bit about how you all think that through.
I mean, number one is deep relationship, right? And they're not relationships that just sprung up in this moment. These are relationships that we've been working on, struggling through sometimes, holding on to our larger vision of the world, of the Oakland, of the country that we want to build, and knowing that that is more important than ego, or a lot of the garbage, as you well know, accompanies this work. And not just with other organizers and nonprofits and grassroots orgs, but with the people themselves, right? The people are your greatest protection. The people are the greatest defense, and the people are actually who you're serving, not your ideas. And those two things I've seen firsthand in this last period, right? Support us in the manifestation of what we're trying to build here, right? Like I said, we said, let's break this curfew. The people said, no, now's the time to push for what you all been talking about for the last almost 6 years. We were like, right? Yes. And then the other thing is intersectionality, right? And having a clear analysis about all of the things that mean public safety. So let's take housing. Housing, probably hands down, is the singular most important issue facing Oaklanders right now. Between 6,000 and 8,000 people sleep in our streets every single night. Standing in solidarity with those issues over the years, crafting, developing, and communicating the analysis that police are actually the shock troops of gentrification. I name Jonas Algany, right? They clear out the communities to be gentrified, and then they use violence to keep us out. And then the second piece of that is housing is public safety, right? Having adequate housing allows people to get jobs, allows people to get healthcare, allows kids to go to school, and connecting those dots. And so those are the three main strategies that have allowed us to get where we are now with coalitions.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. Let me bring Dulce into this conversation. Dulce, you're from the border region. You grew up in Logan Heights, a predominantly Latinx community in San Diego, where many of our country's immigration policies are playing out. You know, when we talk about policing, right, we're not just talking about municipal police, right? We're also talking about INS. We're talking about the Department of Homeland Security. So can you talk about the movement building that you all have been doing in the border region, and how direct action efforts that you're involved in are contributing to efforts to bring about long-term change?
Yes, I think when we think about the border, we don't often think about all of the militarization that's already here, right? Like you mentioned, we have ICE. We also have the presence of Border Patrol. We have the Coast Guard. We have the sheriffs. We have the local police. We even have the school police. You know, it's just a very over-policed area, given that we are so close to the border. These efforts involve, like Kat was saying, relationship building very much with other organizations. I am the chair of the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium this year, which is a coalition of 50 different organizations here in San Diego County. And that is, again, relationship building. And part of that also involves having these conversations with folks that are in office. So we have created subsets, groups, committees that do push our allies, whether it's the Board of Supervisors office, the city council, wherever it may be, and try to defend as much as possible all of the policies that are coming from the federal administration, right? The idea that California is a sanctuary state for migrants it's a misnomer, right? But California is very much a state that is leading in this effort to push back on all of the cruel policies and immigration laws that have been in place for so long that impact all of us, especially here on the border. I think a really good example of a movement is the DACA movement itself, with students, young folks, over 20 years ago when I was in high school. They were protesting. They were literally chaining themselves to congressional desks, putting their bodies on the line until something was negotiated. In this case, Obama approved the DACA program, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which means we just get a work permit, we get to stay here in the US, but it's not a path to citizenship. So the movement's still ongoing, even after 20 years of pushing for something called the DREAM Act that would give us a permanent residency here in the US. And when the Trump administration tried to take what Obama had created, we pushed back and we filed a lawsuit. And it was beautiful to see Garcia v. Trump, but but under that name, it was a whole coalition. It was hundreds of lawyers. So we had to get involved the lawyers as well, 100 lawyers in that team. So many organizations, so many industry, corporations. We had employers submit amicus briefs. So this was really a coalition building of hundreds and thousands of people across the U.S., not just the DACA recipients, the 1.2 million that would be impacted by this legislation, but it would be everyone. And so when we were in the steps of the Supreme Court, we knew we were carrying with us stories from many people and the support of many people across the U.S. So I think that's a great example of movement building, and it's still ongoing. Unfortunately, we still don't have a path to citizenship, and DACA is still in limbo. But we do try to highlight the voices of those border dreamers that are here on the border because of the increased militarization that we experience.
That's incredible. Listen, I mean, we're in such a weird place right now, right? We have temporarily rid ourselves of, the orange menace, as I like to call him. We are now moving into this year with an administration that has a fairly progressive agenda. And I don't know if that's because my bar was super low before, but I can say, right? I mean, the Biden-Harris administration is doing things like moving $400 billion for care infrastructure, care as infrastructure. That's a big deal. They're doing things like advancing COVID-19 relief and recovery, right? And in a lot of ways, what I have said in some of our closer circles, right, is that in some ways our movement is behind, it's like tailing this administration in terms of like pushing things that are progressive. But you know where they're not pushing progressive stuff? Immigration, honey. So I want to just ask you, from your perspective, and we've seen a lot of I don't even know how to articulate the words I want to use for this that are appropriate for this conversation, but there's been a lot of jaw-jacking about nicer cages, right? So cages with bunnies as opposed to no cages. And then we heard earlier this year that Vice President Kamala Harris was going to be kind of tapped, right, to lead this country's response around immigration reform. I got to ask you, Dulce, what is your assessment of the first 100 days of this administration in relationship to immigration reform? Is it enough? Is it going anywhere? Are we having different conversations than what we've been having, not just under the last 4 years of Trump, which, I mean, any conversation that is coherent is different, but the previous 8 years before Trump of Obama, right, where there was a lot of foot dragging and deportations that were happening, right? Like, are we seeing a shift? Are we seeing a lot of the same, or are we going backwards?
I think the Biden administration is failing. That's the grade that I would give. There were a lot of promises that were made during the campaign that haven't been fulfilled yet, and we thought would occur during the first 100 days of the administration. It's failing at the border for sure. The bonds are still in place. The bonds we have noted in the prior administration increased for Black migrants. Migrants that are coming from Cameroon, from other African countries. We bonded 69 people last year with our immigration bond fund, and 65 of them were asylum seekers, mostly from African countries.
Wow. And
we would see them increase from the average $3,500 bond to $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. We were not surprised when we received one for $60,000. Wow. Now you got to keep in mind, when somebody migrates from Cameroon, it's because they're fleeing for their lives. They're not here for pleasure. They're not here to vacation. They are literally fleeing from sometimes their own government. They're fleeing from something horrible that happened to them. They make their way to Brazil and up through various countries. In one case, 13 countries. Wow. Sometimes detained in Mexico for months. They make it to our border, and instead of welcoming them and embracing them, we put them in a detention center. In this place that is run by a private corporation that makes money every single day off of the pain of our people in there. And the bonds are just a way to guarantee that these folks will be in this facility, in this detention center, in this for-profit federal run place. Every single bed that is occupied, this corporation makes money from. And so there's an incentive, even through a pandemic, to not release people as quickly as possible and instead keeping them until they're able to come up with $15,000. We're asking for people that have literally nothing to somehow magically come up with thousands of dollars. It's guaranteeing their incarceration. So this bond system is still in place with the Biden administration. We're still at any given moment have 15,000 migrants in there. We also have in El Chaparral right now, we have 2,000 migrants at the port of entry seeking asylum. We have 500 kids sleeping in tents in the streets without access to water, without access to nutrition. No one knows where the next meal is going to be coming from. And that's because the Biden administration continues to close the doors for asylum seekers. Under Title 42, they're expelling migrants, some Haitians back to danger. Many times the federal government invests in transporting people across the world to deport them instead of processing them for their asylum claim here in the U.S. So we have right now 2,000 people in the streets because the Biden administration is refusing to either acknowledge that asylum is an exemption that should be considered for traveling purposes. You know, we have white people here in Tijuana right now enjoying the nice ocean view and the food, right, for vacation. But asylum is not treated as an essential travel. And so the doors remain closed to them. So that's a huge failure on the Biden administration, where parents have told us they've had to decide whether to send their teenage son alone across the border and therefore become an unaccompanied minor and risk their life crossing and turning them over to a guide, to a coyote, and hope that they make it across. Or stay in this place that is very dangerous for them, where they have received threats from the gangs, the cartels, local residents. It's primarily dangerous for folks that are not speaking Spanish, folks that come from other countries that are Black migrants specifically have a higher risk of being targeted in this area. So the Biden administration is failing those people as well. The shelters in Tijuana, our capacity, we support 17 shelters in Tijuana. All of them are max capacity. When it comes to protecting DACA, when it comes to immigration reform, I have hope, but I'm not holding my breath for it.
I understand. Thank you. That was so helpful and comprehensive. And, you know, this is a good opportunity to say, right, that we are not the only movement in operation right now. That actually at any given time, right, there is a counter movement that is fully operational, that has infrastructure and institutions, right, that is preventing, right, any kind of many of the types of progressive reforms that we want to see, and much less transformational reforms, right? Like there are some, you know, when we talk about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing right now, you know, some of it is because of their own worldview about, you know, who deserves and who doesn't. But it is also very much about responding to this movement that has entrenched power in this country, right? So the idea, right, that asylum is not essential travel is a right-wing idea, right, that they are not yet willing to counter. So that's an important point for us to remember, folks. I want to bring Alex into this conversation. Alex, my friend, where do we even begin? Since the start of this pandemic, we're seeing alarming instances of anti-Asian violence and hate. But you and I both know this is not new, right? This is, you know, very similar to what I was saying to Kat. This is not new. And in fact, this country has always been powered by waves of xenophobia that are targeted at Asian communities for particular purposes, largely economic anxieties, right? And geopolitical dynamics, right? So I want to ask you, talk to us about what you think is happening right now, why you think it's happening, and what's the work that's being done to address this?
That's a big question, and I just want to say thank you first. Just, you know, you got good questions, and I just want to say I've gotten pretty agitated just listening to both Kat and Dulce and yourself, Alicia, and just super honored to be on this panel because there's like so much brilliance that's on the ground right now that is women, queer-led, and leadership that's coming from returning citizens, Southeast Asians, and PIs in our own community. And I'm just lifting that up because oftentimes when we talk about anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism, it's really focused on East Asian folks, right? Mm-hmm. So here's some of the things that I'm observing, and then what are folks doing. The first thing is like what you were talking about, is that Trump's escalation against China and the blaming of COVID on China has exacerbated longtime tensions, like historic kind of things, right? And then with the high profile cases of the elderly Asians, mostly immigrants getting attacked, particularly in the Bay, right? And then the mass killings of Asian immigrant women workers, massage workers, sex workers in Atlanta, the Sikh workers in Indianapolis, Asian and Asian Americans have become very, very visible, right? And there's been an outpour of solidarity expressed at all segments of society. So I feel like that has like put us in a certain place. And there are, number two, a lot of really great openings right now and ways to intersect our movements. But there is a lack of a common strategy. I'm saying this because, you know, working with a lot of the groups on the ground, number one, the way that we're looking at violence is too narrow, right? And we have talked about this, the state violence, economic violence, all of those kinds of things, right? And this violence is not new. Yeah. But I think what's happening is that a lot of Asian folks are seeing anti-Asian racism as something new and or exceptional just to Asian Americans. And I would say the last thing is that a lot of the violence against Asian immigrant women, that has been happening for a long time. And they've always faced threats, especially folks who are working in vulnerable layers of the economy. But what I feel like we're struggling with the most right now is that there is a reliance on the carceral state for solutions instead of having robust alternatives and restorative and transformative justice like what Kat is talking about. And there's some really good experiments happening here in Oakland and in the Bay Area. But across the country, this is the conversation just within the progressive, and I would say like even like just like progressive and liberals. Mm-hmm. The third thing I would say is that there is a lot of exposure and scale than we've ever seen before. And I feel like this is things that we have learned through BLM and the other kind of uprisings, but we have not been here before because the scale and exposure is so different. The conditions are very different, but you know, the grassroots organizations are positioned to contest for a new movement identity, new politics, kind of like what you were talking about, like reconstruction of a new identity, this new we. And this would not have been possible if it wasn't for Black-led, multiracial movements historically, but also like currently, that has like paved the way for Asian Americans to really expand how we look at solidarity and across, right? Not just with the Black community, but also with the Latinx community. So there's a lot of things that I'm seeing, and the groups on the ground, and I'm just gonna give them some props right now. It's like APEN, AAPI Women Lead, New Breath Foundation, APAL in Oakland, right? And then Community Youth Center, CPA, API Force, the Chinese for Affirmative Action, and EPIC. These are just the groups in the Bay Area and California. And there's also a bunch of groups that have been doing this work for a long time that are finally getting the kind of visibility that they deserve, like the gender justice groups, the folks who are doing work against domestic violence, and also organizing sex workers and massage parlor workers. And, you know, this is something like in the Asian community that is not something people look positively at, right? But we are really trying to center those voices right now.
Mm-hmm. Alex, I gotta ask this. I have like 80 questions I want to ask, so let me just condense them because, you know, I'd be doing layered questions. So let me layer for a second, but let me give a little context. You know, one of the things that I am so happy about, and I think the OGs would be happy about this too, right, is that our movements are maturing, if you will. And by maturing, I don't mean that we were young. I mean that we're thinking bigger, right, about what is needed to build the kind of power we need to win. And part of that maturation, I think, is we're starting to resolve this tension around direct action organizing as the core kind of strategy, and electoral organizing, right, as the core strategy. We're finally starting to break down the silos between them and say, hey, these are all tools in a massive toolbox that we need to win shit. So as we are thinking about how we are joining our work in the streets to building political power, it's not an either or, but a both and. Your work with the Center for Empowered Politics has been heavily involved in civic engagement and leadership development work. Can you share with us some of what you're doing to sustain the momentum of the movement? And what are some of the cornerstones of the movement that are necessary to establish long-term governing infrastructure for a progressive agenda?
That was a layered question. Okay, so I love that question, and I can only do this with you, Alicia, because I'm going to take us back to our stomping grounds, where we cut our teeth.
Are we going Rainbow Coalition, or where are we going?
No, before that, we're talking about La Jolla, San Diego, the belly of the beast.
Yeah, baby.
We started organizing at UC San Diego, and that, in Dulce definitely knows this, and this is like in the 90s, right? I've never been in such a white retirement town that was surrounded by such diverse communities, right? And I learned a lot there, right? Because like living in the Bay was like a bubble, right? Meaning that I was around like a lot of like progressive institutions. I went to youth trainings and got trained up in high school. I grew up with like hella Asians, and that was not necessarily the case in La Jolla, of course. But I just want to share this because like I was there for nearly a decade, learned so much. It was like hella intense to live in a border region during 9/11, right? Like on the cusp of the Patriot Act, of like the disappearance of like our youth who are in our youth programs, right? And I learned to experiment. I learned to think about what you were talking about, all the tools in the tool chest, right? And I was like in this place where in San Diego, it's like there was not as much infrastructure, right? But we learned to build across communities, right? We learned to work with labor for all of their shortfalls. And we learned to build long-term leadership, build organizations, and to build regional power. And so I'm saying this because a lot of the things that we've done here in the Bay Area with the Center for Empowered Politics, these are innovations and solutions that I got from another place, right? And just to be real, I feel like for a lot of places, when you talk about innovation, and the Bay has a lot of good stuff too, of course, because we're here, and I feel that, and Oakland's the center of the known universe. All that is cool, right? But just to just spreading the love. But I'm just saying, a lot of innovations happening across the country in places that are under-resourced, and of course in the Bay, where a lot of innovations are coming from places that do not have those kind of resources. But when I was at the Chinese Progressive Association for the last 15 years, we did something very similar. We built a strong team, right? We're doing the organizing, investing in leadership development and organizing in our communities. And in that time, we just created form that followed our functions, right? We were winning shit, right? Losing too, right? But we were still right. I mean, around Lenar. Anyways, moving on. But we formed C3s, C4s, PACs, and an LOC ecosystem, right? And when we were thinking about the national election last year, we were like, what can the Bay do to not do what we usually do, which is like, oh, national elections, Trump has nothing to do with us. Oh, we're in California, we can't make any change. We're just going to do our own thing, right? We basically wanted to leverage what we had here in the Bay to form a partnership, a multiracial intervention to defeat Trump, but also to build a movement. And that was called Seed the Vote, right? And this was an intervention that was very different because we were not talking about supporting Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. We were basically saying, get Trump out of office. We need to win and get rid of that slide towards authoritarianism. And we learned to do this kind of work to flank other regions, right? So it wasn't a parachute model. It was like trying to really think about how do we work with other regions and do cross-regional work, and just how do we support in that way? And I just like that flanking lateral thing that is more present, right? And like I think Kat talked about this. It's like there's a lot of ego in the movement, right? We weren't trying to like be the next thing. We were just like, yo, what do you need? And let's try to like win this thing, right? So we were able to mobilize 9,000 volunteers, but most significantly move 1,000 people to Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and Florida, right? And that was like not something people were trying to do in COVID, right? And so we had taken a risk to use our infrastructure for that. But that's some of the experimentation I just wanted to share, because it is about organizing and building power and winning. But I think right now, in a lot of ways, we get siloed in the ways, if you want to call it short-termism, where political work is seen as very transactional. And then there's long-termism, where it's like, oh, we just want this kind of big vision, but we need to build strategy towards that vision and not get distracted.
That's right. That's right. All right, let's bring everybody into the conversation now, because I want to just talk a little bit about what it is that we're fighting for. You know, for those of us who have been doing this work for a long time, we have a North Star, right? And the North Star is where we ultimately want to go. And then we take a bunch of steps to get closer to that North Star, to get into that direction. So Kat, I want to start with you and just hear a little bit about, you know, so much of the way we talk about our work is around issues, right? Police violence, immigration, you know, housing, workers' rights, right? And that's all cool and fine, right? But these are our lives, right? These are our lives. These are our full lives, and our lives are three-dimensional. They are not siloed in these ways, right? And so I want to talk about what it is that we're ultimately fighting for and how it is that we ultimately think we're going to get there. What is it that is needed in this moment, infrastructure-wise, movement-wise, culture-wise, to get us a little bit closer to that North Star?
All right, Alicia, you see you in your layers?
I'm sorry.
All right, I got two of the layers, so I'm just gonna start with there. You made me tear up. Look, the question made me tear up. This conversation's making me tear up. And not to be woo-woo about it, but what I'm fighting for is represented upstairs, right? Like ultimately, you know, my daughter is, believe it or not, sis, she's gonna be a junior next year.
I can't.
Hold on to that, right?
No.
And out into the world, you know, and I've always said that like my job is to move the needle, even if it's just this much, so that I am not handing to her. We collectively are not handing to her, to the other babies that have raised up in this movement, in this world, the exact same world that we got, right? Fuck that. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm tearing up because I feel both, and I don't feel like we are actually. I feel like I feel like this is the first time in my 20 plus years as an organizer that I can say, man, we're doing some things, right? And we're doing things that are going to concretely impact both the qualitative and quantitative quality of our lives and thus their lives. Yeah. And it's still so up, right? It's still so like, you know, Micaiah Bryant, so like I was sitting there, as I know you were, right, waiting on the verdict, and then of course, you know, right, work started right away. Right. I couldn't even get to my daughter, who's been raised in this movement with no wins, right, or hardly little to no wins. And I wanted to get upstairs to her. I finally got upstairs to her. It was like, right? And the joy in her face. And then she went back to school and I went back to work. And no sooner did I sit my black ass down on the couch that a child this much older than mine, shares her skin color, was murdered, right? So I'm fighting for no more of those moments. We're fighting for no more of those moments. We're fighting for an end on the war, on Black life, on brown life, on queer life, on poor life, right? We're fighting for the world. And Alicia, actually, it took me a minute. And I've been tracking you with this language, and I finally was able to use it, honestly, recently, right? We're fighting for the America that she promises us, but that ultimately we believe she can be. And I don't know that I believe that alone. I'd like get there, right? We're fighting for that. And I think this moment in our movement, and I was so glad to hear you say at the beginning, this is not the beginning, right? Because I heard that a lot in the streets. This is the beginning. No, 400+ year track record of us fighting for the first, African kidnapped and dropped off on these shores. The infrastructure is necessary right now. So we're thinking about as APTP how we move from an organization to an institution, and what about our practices works here that can't be dropped on another community, but right, how can we support the coalition building, the impacting the public debate? I know this is also something you deeply in, right? Communications can't be tactic, it's got to be one of our primary strategies. We've got to stop talking to each other and talking to the people that actually don't think that Black people should be shot in broad daylight in the back, but aren't quite where we are either, right? They've got a moral compass, and we need to figure out how to direct that moral compass in the right way. We need resources. We need to be resourcing ourselves, and we need to stop waiting for the master to give us the tools for our liberation. And what I mean by that, it was an internal lesson too. Like we ask, 6 years ago when we launched Defund OPD, was to take 50% of OPD's budget, invest it in 24/7 mental health services for the city of Oakland, and to invest in the creation of a model of response to mental health crisis that didn't lead with law enforcement. That's APTP. We asked the state for shit. I don't know what was in our heads, but we did, and then we did. And we did. And then we were like, what are we doing? And we built our own. And that, this ties into part of the question I didn't answer last time. That's my advice. Build our own shit. Right? Be the alternatives for the masses so that they can see there is another way to do things. And that's a cross issue area, right? Like we have to engage with the state for sure. We engage in what we call radical reforms that chip away at the status quo and hopefully are stemming the tide of our bodies that are dropping all over the country. And simultaneously, we've got to build our stuff and show the people, see, we can do it. There is another way, and stop waiting for the state to correct their lies. And tell us the truth, because they're not going to. It's not in their best interest. Yes,
that's right. Yes, Dulce, what you got to say on this question? Where are we trying to go, and how do we get there? What do we need in order to get there?
Yeah, well, we're trying to not have to do this work in the future. As you mentioned, I'm tired too, and I want to see our communities thrive and not just be on survival mode. I think comprehensive immigration reform has to have a holistic approach where we do end the criminalization, the system that we have in place that is based on punishment of immigrants. We have to rework the frame that we work under as a country, get this away from this idea that immigrants are hurting our country when we know it's quite the opposite and all the data show it. And so we should reframe our thinking, our language, our policies, our laws from a humanitarian aid approach, humanitarian principles that seek to welcome the other and not fear of the other. So I think that's where we would like to see this happen. The abolishment of ICE is just one small portion of it. We really have to do this entire system where we have thousands of people in detention centers for absolutely no reason. Really no reason. And the immigration officers on the ground that determine these bonds amount, it's so arbitrary. So there's no policy written in place, and it's just randomly assigning super high bonds to Black migrants specifically are the ones that get the highest bonds. So we have to undo this entire system where private corporations are making money off of the pain of these people. So we work towards that goal of not having to do this work. I think that this is the time that we all work together, all of our movements, with a better strategy, and recognizing that no one is free, right? No one is free until Black people are free. We can't have protections for immigrants when Blacks are massively incarcerated. It impacts migration as well. right? And the U.S. has to also recognize the impact that it has globally, and recognize that people are migrating precisely because of the decisions that are made here in the U.S. that force people to migrate in the first place. So it's a daunting task. I do want to see the wall come down. The Berlin Wall came down. This wall was in place at one point. Operation Gatekeeper came about in the 90s. So I want us to not go back prior to the 90s. I want us to be better than what we have ever been. I don't think that it's impossible or that I'm like wishful thinking. I think this is a long list of things that need to happen. And it requires all of us to recognize the interconnection in our movements and go from there. But it is going to require not just work in the streets. It's going to require works in the legislative side as well, in the Supreme Court as well. It's going to take an undoing of the entire system, really.
That's absolutely right. Ooh, Dulce, you got me hyped up. I'm like, yeah, wait, you're right. In my lifetime, I've seen the destruction of walls that we all thought were permanent, right? And the border wall is no exception. And I hope, and I will work for, that in my lifetime, that wall is out of here. Alex, take us home, my homie. Where are we trying to go here, Bled? And what do we need to do to get there?
The path forward.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I'm just getting all the feels. And I think I'll start off with like what you start off with in the beginning. And it really resonated, this thing around reconstructing society, right? I just want, and thinking about that, about the new we, is really important. And why I think about that is like, I also think about, and I was actually going to write a blog about this. I think about my little one, he's 6 years old. I think about the trauma and healing of our little ones, right? He hates Trump, like, I mean, hate, right? And he is afraid of turning 10 because one time I mentioned that Trump might run again. And, I just think about the kinds of things that they're living with right now, and the kind of era that we're in is like so deeply, profoundly, it's so painful, right? But it's also just thinking about like, and we went to San Diego, we visited like this museum, and he saw this video about the World War II and the Nazis. And he was so fixated on how people could believe and hate others because they're superior, right? And so, and I bring this up because I don't know what it's going to take to heal, right? And to come to restore. And maybe this is why it's helpful to think differently. And this came up on your podcast last week. Basically, it's like, it's not, maybe we're not trying to restore, right? We're not trying to heal. We're trying to forge a path forward, right? And I think that was really helpful for me because, I just went through the whole rubric. I was like, okay, we're thinking about restorative justice. And like, and he was already thinking like, okay, so we need to do a school for Nazis and like train them to be like, to be better. I was like, oh damn, okay, no. Let's just find new alternatives to move things forward. Not to say restorative justice does not work, but it's like we are thinking about new ways to restore and transform, right? The other thing I just want to say is like we need solidarity within and solidarity across. And I said this a little bit before, but again, as a cis Chinese East Asian male, in a lot of these conversations, there are a lot of missing voices and narratives within our own community. Undocumented folks who are getting deported, like in our own community, right? Killing of like Sikh folks, domestic violence, all of those kinds of things just in our own community don't get lifted up, especially like Pacific Islander issues, right? And so that's one important piece for at least in the Asian community that we need to do. But it's also important to build solidarity across, right? And I just keep thinking about the relationships, the deep relationships that all of y'all have been building. That is so key. And there's like a lot of young people right now coming in, and they don't know how to do this, right? And they're thinking that this is something that happens overnight, and this is maybe how we've been talking about movement building, right? And so one of the things I've been trying to think about is like, as we are in this place building movement infrastructure and winning shit, we are opening doors, busting doors open. We are making our own doors, like breaking through walls. But how do we keep those doors open, right? And so for people just to keep coming in and out, like however they wish, right? Because like people need to find their own pace. And some people want to go hella fast, right? But we want to bring people along. And some people want to go really slow. And I think the main thing is not to get distracted and to get stuck and to stop, right? Because that's what the system wants us to do, is to stop because of a critique, because of a contradiction, because it's not perfect, right? Because of some beef, right? And so I just keep thinking about that path forward. Like we just need to keep moving, not get distracted, keep our eyes on the prize, keep, hold our close ones tight, and like just keep building with all the people around us.
I love y'all so much. Like I didn't know how much I needed this conversation until it just happened. You know what I'm saying? So thank you. Thank you all for this. And I guess in my closing thoughts, I want to say, what I love about this conversation, and I don't get to have enough of it, but I want to have it more, is that, we didn't fucking talk about protest not one time. And you know what? I actually appreciate that, because protest is like an expression of our rage and our grief. It is an expression of our resistance, but it is not the only work of movement building. Everything that you all just talked about is the work. It is how we push forward towards this North Star. So I want to thank each of you, Kat, Dulce, Alex, for opening to us and being vulnerable with us about what it is that we do, right, in between protests that actually help move this country forward and make it become what it has promised us it would be. Also, I want to just leave us with this final question, which I'm not asking you all to answer, but I want us to just hold in this next period. Alex, you're absolutely right that we have been fighting for so long under the worst conditions that now that there are openings, right, sometimes it's hard for us to acknowledge that we're winning, that we are winning. And it's not everything that we want, and it's not always how we want it, but you know what? We are winning, and we will continue to win as long as we stay focused and keep our feet on the ground and keep our eyes on the prize. But with that being said, and I believe it is, this is a new moment of reconstruction. And let's say that we have a window of 10 to 13 years to make some of the most radical reforms that we possibly can. What kind of architects do we need to be? What are we going to build? And what is the story of who we are going to be together? Thank you, Greenlining Institute, for the opportunity to moderate this conversation. Thank you again, Kat Brooks, Dulce Garcia, Alex Tom. I'm going to kick it back over to the Greenlining team, but I hope you enjoyed us, and have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.